Okay, and welcome back to Supernova Labs. Today I wanted to go into a couple of subjects in particular, but I think it's probably best to start with Bitcoin SV and cryptocurrency. One thing I wanted to go into is the reason why we're building on Bitcoin SV and why at least with the research that I put into this, the best chain I've found for doing this. Uh, it mostly boils down to the fact that we can put the entire file on chain as part of the transaction, and it costs the same as the gas fees to just mint a reference to the file on any other chain. So normally you would, with Ethereum for example, you would pay all these gas fees. I mean, they can be in the hundreds, they can be in the thousands, for a reference to the interplanetary file system, IPFS, and then it uses BitTorrent to basically serve the file to you. So it has some reference on some chain. Whereas with Bitcoin SV, you can just read the transaction data and the file comes with it. So you're actually paying to write all that data to the chain. Now, that has obviously massive advantages in terms of deploying solutions. We do like a little augmented reality experience where it shows a sword that we sold, and that is actually pulling directly from the transaction the entire file to display that to the app, which is exactly what NFTs should be. I mean, it's just the way that, I don't know, maybe I don't want to preach to anybody and say this is the one way it should be done, but it's the most logical sense. It works in the most logical sense for me. Now, I'm not saying that this is the best way of doing it. I think that we're going to look back on this time period in cryptocurrency like it was all very primordial, and we're just beginning to see how these consensus algorithms can be used to build smart contracts. And there are some things that I'd want to. Well, I've posted about in the past. I wrote an article about what chain was it again? A long time ago, Nexus Earth, and how their system of mining prime numbers can be used to catalog in-space objects. Now, I haven't looked into Nexus Earth in a long time now, I will admit, so who knows, maybe they have implemented they were planning on putting up a satellite, they were planning on doing all kinds of things, but when it comes to cryptocurrency, you can't take anybody as far as you can throw them, so let's see where they've ended up. My reasoning for bringing this up is because I wanted to link this back to something I was speaking to in my previous video, which was the lunar operating system. And I was talking about some cryptocurrency based operating system for in-space hardware and APIs and how all these things can start working together. And I think there's one underutilized feature of cryptocurrency is the ability to fork the chain. So what typically happens, well, look at Bitcoin for example, right? The history of Bitcoin SV is that there have been several schisms, let's say, in the community surrounding Bitcoin, such that some wanted to take the technology in one direction, some wanted to take the technology in another direction. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of it because that's been overdone. But as a result of that, people decided to run a separate code base with the same chain of history, and that is what they define as a fork. So there is a branching at that point. I mean, maybe fork's not really the right word for it. It's more of a branching of history at that point. And there's been about 3 or 4 different branches of Bitcoin, all with different reasons for wanting their particular style of Bitcoin or otherwise. And BSV is the one where they were like, okay, we want to uncap this block size so we can fit massive files in there, so that we can just unshackle it from all of the people that were saying, okay, well, you'd lose a lot of the decentralization. I mean, it's a valid criticism that it becomes a lot harder to mine for Joe Public. Whether they were doing that in the first place is a different question entirely. But this whole idea of forking is something that I don't know if anybody really explored. I mean, like, bear in mind I haven't looked into it, so it may be that there are people working on this. But when it comes to space, space is absolutely massive. I think that much is obvious. I mean, if you haven't seen the pale blue dot image, it puts it into pretty stark contrast quite how small our planet is when it comes to wider space. Now, the reason I bring this up is specifically surrounding space settlement and going out and mining the asteroid belt and starting to think about economies that will sustain themselves in space. Being able to send out forward parties of drones that can go out to the asteroid belt, that can go out to parts of the moon and do like preliminary surveys, such as orbiting bodies to get their like center of mass, their size, their approximate composition based on their like the relative gravity of different areas of the rock. If that were all written on a fork of the chain for that particular object, it then becomes almost like a chain of record for that specific object. And it also means that so long as there's a chain of history backwards as well, you can link it back to specific drones, and you don't need to be in the area to, well, sorry, like you don't need to have all the information that's being produced at once. What it allows you to do is, suppose I am some prospector in the future, I have my own private spacecraft, I'm a privateer in space, and I want to go and mine some material, right? So what I would do is, I would come along to a specific region of space where I know that there are rocks to mine, and then put out a ping for some kind of database in the area, and that would feed back to me all of the chain data for the objects in that area. So you then end up with this kind of distributed storage solution, but that acts along branches, so that you don't end up with these like massively inflated chains. You don't need massive hardware and infrastructure to maintain a network, because all you're really bothered about is maintaining the chain of history for a specific object. Now you can expand this further to most other objects. I mean, like some kind of, what I imagine, a deed to a house, for example, on its own specific chain. There was a point at which I talked about like people having their own cryptocurrency that was logging like what they do, but that sounds, I've with additional thought and having watched the recent, what was it? It was one of the Star Wars animated things, the Bad Batch, and how that catalogued the implementation of chain codes in the Star Wars universe. Means I would probably advise just against doing that in general, because it's just giving people chain codes and logging everything they're doing is inherently problematic. It has a chilling effect on society in general, and everybody just ends up worse off. I mean, GCHQ, NSA, if you're listening, like, you gotta book up, delete your logs, or share them with us, because people can't be free if they're watched. There's also another element to this as well, where if you look at the way that NASA has put out specific protocols for managing databases between satellites and transmission, I think they put out a white paper on disruption tolerant networking a while ago. So if you imagine you've got satellites going around planets, there are periods where those satellites they can't see each other because they're behind the planet, for example. Like, how do you transmit data in a way where it all gets there? And it's basically a system of flags, so that it's like in a similar way to a distributed network, like almost like a gossip protocol, where it retransmits data until it's marked on across the network as it being delivered. And I think there's quite a neat pairing between the distributed system I was talking about just then and the disruption tolerant networking stack that NASA is building their satellite networks to right now. Now, I can't speak for Starlink and how they're building, whether they're going to put out their own standards for this in future, or whether they're just going to adopt disruption tolerant networking. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much everything I wanted to say today. So with that, I will spare you any additional rambling. I hope you have a wonderful evening.